Introducing the one, the only, the greatest, hopefully, Rachel Anderson and Patrick Dewar.
Oh my gosh! Oh my word! Had your speech good. All right. In ancient societies, particularly throughout Greece and Rome, the art of rhetoric was held much higher regard than we today understand. You see, with the rise of democracy and public court systems, the common man was able to use rhetoric to change his stars, basically. Before then, you were what you were born to. But now they could actually have a voice in government and in law affairs, and they could wield this through the art of rhetoric if they could affect people through their speeches. And so, this new era, with such emphasis as was placed on rhetoric, was bound to produce some of the greatest speakers and authors that the world has ever seen. Two such men were Isocrates and Claudius Aelianus.
In Athens, in the 400s BC, is where we find Isocrates. He had the unique privilege of being born into a time when rhetoric was upcoming, and he was in the center for innovation of such arts. He was born into a rich family and studied with such men as the Sophists and Socrates throughout his lifetime. He was also a rival in school and thought to Plato and Aristotle. He was not a good speaker, which may seem very odd for a rhetorician, but he wrote his speeches out so that other men could give them and so that they could be published in newspapers to get his point across.
Aelian, on the other hand, was Roman-born, who was actually several hundred years later, 3rd century AD to be specific. And however, even though he was Roman and he was much later, he harkens back to the ancient Greek styles and was even called honey-tongued because he mastered Greek so well and used it in most of his works and his speeches. In fact, it was commented that he even spoke Greek better than some of the natives of Greece. And so, basically, Aelian was a Stoic, and he approached his arguments in a very roundabout fashion, which was very unique. You see, most of his works were actually in the form of almanacs and such. And so he gave commentary on subjects such as the sciences and various histories, but subtly, through these things, he would promote Stoicism, which is the Greek philosophy of promoting moralism and stronger virtues as the key to a successful life. Rachel will tell you why these are important.
So the question may come to mind, why study rhetoric and why study the dead men who used it in many years past? Well, it may seem that they don't matter, but from them we can pull tools and techniques that are still applicable today. Because after all, we use speaking on a daily basis in our normal lives, and at school, and in our workplace, and to convince people, we use speaking. We will see that we can learn a balance of two styles to use in speech. Solid and meaningful, but interesting. And this was useful back then as well as today.
Now, these men were great solely because of their abilities as pertaining to rhetoric. They were not bought into position. They were not born into position. They were simply great because they had the ability to be great. This was a novel concept in the ancient world. And so you see, each of these men embodied specific traits of rhetoric. While Isocrates had a very practical and logical, straightforward approach, Aelian tended to come around in sort of an allegorical fashion. Now, each of these men thus exemplify a different element of rhetoric. However, the key to this is unifying these two elements of rhetoric to comprise an even greater argument than they had before. Now, we'll give some examples of this.
Isocrates is our first example of such things. He was a man who had a great effect on years afterward, which continued, here he is with his conclusion, which continued through such times as the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, because people who followed his ideas were big contributors to ideas of the Renaissance. So his work showed us a straightforward take on rhetoric. He saw and used rhetoric as a practical tool, This tool was to be used for the public opinion and for the politics of the day, for these were the things that he saw as quite important. Not for excitement or personal attention or personal gain was rhetoric, but for the betterment of the real world. He didn't use any tricks or any different things to pull a mystical element into his speeches, but he used persuasion to get across the point he wanted to make and the outcome that he wanted to see. In his style, he found a middle ground between the completely theoretical and the practical, so he used elements of both. He valued natural talent and practical experience as elements to be used in his ways of rhetoric. For an example of his overall idea, a quote from Against the Sophists from him. He says, "If all who are engaged in the profession of education were willing to state the facts instead of making greater promises than they can possibly fulfill, they would not be in such bad repute with the lay public." Here we see his emphasis on the facts, practicality, and straightforwardness.
Now, as we said, Aelian was a stark Stoic, and so naturally, through all of his works, he wanted to promote the moralistic ideals which he so strongly believed in. Now, an example, one of his works, entitled Various Histories, which I have a picture of up here, it's in Greek, as you can see, which was Greek to him. He uses an example of the Egyptian frogs. Now, in his day, he used a lot of the local superstitions to provide an air of mystique and really get the attention of his audience. So what he does here is he uses something that sounds so foreign and interesting to them to really catch their attention, but then he causes them to ponder it. In this he says that the frogs of Egypt, living in the Nile, where there are also serpents, would see a serpent nearby and thus would feel threatened. Now what they would do was they would go and take a reed, a small piece of one at least, and hold it in their mouth sideways so that when the serpent came up and attacked it, it would not actually be able to swallow the frog because it would have to swallow the reed as well, and thus was not big enough. And so what he actually does is praises the wisdom and cleverness of this frog as sort of a moral example or a fable, we can call them, to give to the public. So even in commentaries on the sciences and such things that he was genuinely interested in, his beliefs shone through all of this, and thus made his point. This is an important element of rhetoric, which is worth emulating. And so, with these two characteristics, which are embodied by the two different speakers, we can bring them together, and even though they are from very different backgrounds, very different times, they can fit together in a way that will promote the speech enormously, broaden your audience, and broaden the effect it will have on them. And so, Rachel will continue.
Here we have seen how different tools have been used in the history of rhetoric. These tools can be unified to be used in rhetoric, speeches in general, and communication throughout our daily life, like I mentioned before. These two men came from different times, different places. They had different opinions and used different methods and ways. Both of their ways were useful, both then in the ancient world and today. They are examples to us of how to speak, and we can pull these two examples together to create a well-rounded argument in the ways that we speak today.
A well-rounded and effective speech is the key to causing change, and causing change is a cause for greater change. It's how you leave your mark on the world. And so, rhetoric, thus, has shown its importance in everyone's life, and not only in the lives of great philosophers or authors. And as the great quote runs, "The broad masses of a population are more than amenable to the appeal of rhetoric as opposed to any other force." Adolf Hitler.